think we are live now. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. We've got some thumbs up there. Very good. Welcome, participants, to this session on other effective area-based measures, for short, OECMs. My name is Renee Sauvé, and I'm your moderator and chair for this session. I am currently a senior advisor on international oceans policy with the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. I have and continue to represent Canada on various multilateral negotiations related to marine biodiversity and ocean governance. I'm currently the North American representative on the FAO Committee on Fisheries, and I am continue to be engaged in various negotiations, such as the emerging UN agreement on areas beyond national jurisdiction and the marine elements of the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, which I think many of you are participating in these weeks. Thank you, first of all, for taking time to join us today. I know there are many meetings going on. The topic is OECMs today, a term that really came into prominence in 2010 with ACHI 11 target under CBD using that term. And really much attention has been on how many of the ACHI targets have not been met. However, what has been very useful in this period with that term, it's really forced us to think a bit more exactly what OECMs mean and what is entailed in implementing them. So today's session will be a keynote presentation in which we will examine 5 case studies to consider some of these implementation challenges and how we can improve our advice to fisheries managers as they try and increase their building of resilient biodiversity. So today we will start off again with a keynote presentation, followed by some comments and observation by our expert panelists, which I will introduce later. You will have an opportunity as participants to pose questions after each of the panelists answers an initial question. There is the Q&A option on this platform that you can use to pose your question. So do not use the raise hand function. We have close to 100 participants, so it will be a bit confusing. So please pose your question in the Q&A option and indicate if there's a particular panelist you want to direct that question to. We will monitor the questions that are posed, and we will pose that to the panelists. So those are kind of our parameters for this session. So let's start off with our keynote presentation today by Serge Garcia. I think a number of you know Serge. He's been around in this field for a long time. Initially trained as a biological oceanographer, he later took on leadership roles in fisheries management, including as Chief Marine Resources Service and Director of Fisheries Management Division at FAO. Building on his work at the FAO, he has increasingly focused on the challenges related to fisheries and biodiversity. Currently, he's chair of the Fisheries Expert Group of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management, and a role he has served for over 10 years. So he is well placed to provide an update on this issue. And Serge, I will turn it over to you, and I think you can share your presentation, and it'll start people thinking on the topic today.
Thank you, Renee. I will try to share my screen. I hope you see it correctly. Do you? Are you seeing the presentation correctly, Renee? Yes?
Yes, it looks very
Okay,
clear.
okay. So, thanks for the presentation. It's a lot for a retiree. My only boss now is essentially my wife. But dear participants, I wish all of you a good day, wherever you are. In this presentation on other effective area-based conservation measures in marine capture fisheries, I will remind you briefly of the CBD decision on OECMs and of the type of area-based measures that are used in fisheries management. Then I will present the conclusions reached in the North Atlantic in the workshop we have organized with the International Council of the Exploration of the Sea with the IUCN Fisheries Expert Group in March 2021. As you all probably know by now, OECMs have been created in 2010 as a new type of area-based conservation area in the Aichi Target 11 as a complement to MPAs. In 2018, the decision 14.8 of the CBD COP 14 provided a formal definition of OECMs, as well as a set of criteria and principles for their identification. This decision contains also voluntary guidance on integration and governance and calls on states to mainstream OECMs across economic sectors. As a contribution to this effort, the IUCN Fisheries Expert Group, in collaboration with FAO experts, has elaborated background documents containing detailed considerations of the CBD decision from a capture fishery angle. These elements were there considered at an FAO CBD FEG meeting in 2019 in Rome, and more recently at an ICES FEG meeting in the North Atlantic, the conclusions of which will be presented later. The entire CBD decision 14.8 is relevant when considering OECMs in the fishery sector, but the criteria specifically require that the area being considered is first not already designated as an MPA, that it is well governed and managed, that it achieves sustained and effective contribution to in situ conservation of biodiversity, and that it accounts also for ecosystem function and services, as well as cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. Together, these criteria and the related sub-criteria determine the OECM identification framework. In order to ensure long-term sustainability, the fisheries closures usually have one or more of these three objectives. First, to optimize the exploitation of the target species. Second, to allocate space and resources between subsectors for equity and conflict reduction. And third, to provide broader conservation for protected, endangered, and threatened species, to reduce unwanted bycatch, and to protect essential and vulnerable habitats. These fishery closures vary greatly in terms of duration, location, ecological domain, fishing activity concern, type of governance, etc. The terminology used that you see on the right is complex and not totally consistent between countries and areas. So because of that variability, and because of the fact that the performance of these areas is highly context sensitive, any generalization regarding their potential as OECM candidate is questionable. And this calls for a very systematic case-by-case analysis of these areas. Let's see now very briefly the outcome of the expert workshop that has been organized by the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, ICES, and the IUCN Fisheries Expert Group in March 2021. 6 studies from the North Atlantic were used as examples, 5 of which were in capture fisheries, and we will briefly describe them here. These areas differ in size, in the biodiversity features that they protect, in the type of fisheries and conservation measures in place, in terms of jurisdictional authority, in expected biodiversity benefit, external threats, etc. And the objectives of the meeting were to first consolidate and test the available guidance on identification, drawing on the case studies. Second, it was to identify the factors affecting the evaluation. Third, it was to identify the information of particular value in the identification process, and fourth, to provide feedback on the evaluation guidance available. So first of all, the Rockall Adol box. This is a typical fishery closure that has been established primarily to optimize the haddock fishery, but it contains and it is surrounded by vulnerable marine ecosystems, and it is already impacted by climate change that is affecting the performance for fishery. The Northeast UK sand eel closure is established in a sand eel fishing ground specifically to protect seabirds and their prey, that is the sand eels that they consume, in their foraging area. The corner-rise seamounts is a very classical deep-sea ecosystem under the jurisdiction of the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization. Their seamounts contain well-identified biodiversity values. They have been subject to very high fishing pressure in the past, and severe measures have already been taken, including a moratorium on bottom fishing. The NAFO sponge vulnerable marine ecosystem closed areas in the Flemish Cap and Grand Bank, they stand on an important fishing ground for Greenland halibut. They host rich deep sea biodiversity values that have been also historically stressed by fishing. They are well studied and managed. The fishery has established many closed areas protecting VMEs, and over 60% of the known sponge biomass is now protected, and the NAFO governance of these areas is under regular performance review. Finally, the Lophelia pertusa is the coral reef. This is the only one living reef known in Canadian waters, and it is rich in other biodiversity values. The protection and recovery of these values are the primary objective of the fishery closure. The area is close to bottom trawling, but there may be some looming threats from oil and gas and cable sectors. The area is enforced and monitored. We really do not have the time to go into detailed reviews undertaken on each of these case studies during the meeting. The aim of that review was to find out whether the guidance available, including the fishery-specific guidance, was easily applicable. The table shows the areas in rows and the criteria in columns. The table indicates that for many of the OCM criteria that appear in green on the table, the necessary information was available. It could easily be matched to the criteria, and in fact, the matching would lead to consider these criteria as met. In fewer cases, which you see in yellow on the map, on the table, the information was incomplete, or the criteria were not considered clear enough, and this called for additional guidance, additional information, and additional collaborations. For example, for better competency in ecosystem and social sciences, to be able to complete correctly the assessment. Some general conclusions, I think, come from the exercise. Sorry for these wordy slides, but they will help you later on if you want to reconsider the presentation. So, despite some initial difficulties by the participants in understanding fully the criteria, all areas in the end were found to meet the criteria enough to warrant consideration of the case studies as potential OECMs for a fuller assessment, should the appropriate jurisdiction choose to move in that direction. It will be up to states to decide. It should be noted, however, that first, the case studies were pre-selected by the workshop participants and were not a random sample of areas from the North Atlantic. Otherwise, it is likely that a smaller proportion of areas would have been found suitable. Second, the North Atlantic area benefits from well-developed information and governance systems, even though gaps were identified, for instance, in ecological, social, and economic information and competencies. In many other regions of the world, some capacity building would be required to undertake similar assessments. Third, all areas were found as producing significant biodiversity benefits, both intended and unintended, and all areas benefit also from a relatively effective governance by a legitimate authority. Fourth, The compilation of information prior to the assessment was found to be an essential factor of success for the meeting that greatly facilitated the quick screening of the areas. And fifth, the favorable enabling scientific and governance conditions that exist in that region appeared essential for both the identification and the performance assessment of OECMs. During the exercise, the expert called for more specific fishery guidance regarding, for example, the interpretation of the criteria, their requirements, and their relative importance for the identification, as well as on the level of evidence that was required to consider the criteria as met. They also struggled with the definition of the long-term intent, and particularly the acceptable time horizon of the measure and the level of guarantee that would be required. They stress that a range of multidisciplinary expertise would be needed to undertake the assessment. They also stress the need for cross-sectoral collaboration to deal properly with external threats. And they also stress the need to combine analytical assessment with expert views and local knowledge in data-limited situations. They also stressed the fact that biodiversity benefits should probably include both maintenance of biodiversity and recovery of biodiversity as appropriate. Some particular challenges were also noted regarding the need to assess the situation both inside and outside the OECM. The difficulty met in determining causal relationships, for example, between threats and biodiversity. The resulting difficulty of assessing effectiveness and the need to consider both the measures applied and the outcomes obtained through those measures. The difficulty also to effectively address equity in different contexts and to ensure participation of the sector in the evaluation. They stress also the need to probably consider mobile OECMs in the future to mitigate climate change and the related changes in distribution and biodiversity and of fishing. And finally, the patchiness of certain biodiversity features like vulnerable marine ecosystems call for identifying either numerous distinct OECMs in the same area, eventually connected as a functional network, or to aggregate the small OECMs in a larger, more complex measure. But I hope that these conclusions will be of interest to all of you and lead to useful discussions. Together with the panel, I remain at your disposal for any clarification you may need. Thank you very much. And you have here some useful links where you can find documents that would help you find more information on OECMs in the fishery sector.
Well, thank you very much for that, Serge. It does make us ponder on some of the challenges ahead of us. I would like to move to the panel part of our session. Serge will be on our panel, so if you have a question of clarification related to the presentation, please feel free to raise it during this panel portion of today's session. So just looking at that, I mean, I think it's quite clear, and I know from a state perspective, but I think from stakeholders also, it's clearly recognized the importance of trying to mainstream biodiversity objectives within sector activities. That's well recognized, I think I can say. But how to do that? So this does present a number of challenges, as we saw in Serge's presentation, and the illustrative questions in your agenda touches on some of the practical implementation issues. So we will launch our discussions today by asking our panelists to address some of these aspects. This will be followed by a chance for you as participants to raise any questions to the panelists after each question is posed to them. So please take note of a particular question, a probing question you may have you want to address in the Q&A section, again, of the platform. And Let's start the initial discussion with our panelists. So I will introduce who we have with us today just briefly. In alphabetic order, we have Joseph Appiot. Mr. Appiot coordinates the work on marine and coastal and island biodiversity at the CBD Secretariat, where he works with governments, international organizations, and other stakeholders to support the implementation of the CBD Convention. Mr. Appiot's work also includes coordination with other UN agencies and multilateral processes with regards to issues related to marine, coastal, and island biodiversity. I think I'll do just a quick introduction with all our participants. Next on our panel, we have Daniela Diz. She is an associate professor of ocean governance at the Lyell Center, based at the Heriot Watt University in Scotland, and she is a member of the IUCN Fisheries Expert Group. We also have with us today Amber Himes-Cornell. Ms. Himes-Cornell is a fisheries officer at the FAO and is the area-based management focal point for the Fisheries Division. She has been leading FAO's efforts to develop guidance on applying the OECM criteria in the fishery sector and to organize a series of regional sharing learning workshops to provide technical capacity for the OECM assessment process and get input on the needed content for the OECM guidance. We were to have with us today Mr. Harry Jonas. Mr. Jonas is an international environmental lawyer working to promote equity and effectiveness in conservation law, policy, and practice. Mr. Jonas is the co-chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Specialist Group on OECMs. Mr. Jonas is based in Malaysia, and due to extreme weather events happening there right now, he will not be able to join us today, but our other panelists, I think, will try and cover off some of the aspects that may be raised related to effectiveness and equity. And finally, we have Mr. Andrew Kenny. Mr. Kenny is a principal scientist and advisor working for the CEFAS, which is the Center for Environment, Fisheries, and Aquaculture Science. It is an executive agency of the UK government. He has a PhD in marine biology from the University of East Anglia and has for the last 10 years been leading on the development of methods to assess significant adverse impacts on deep sea vulnerable marine ecosystems. So I think I would like to start off then with just a small number of questions posed to our panelists, which again I think will help your thinking on any further points that you may want to pose to the panelists, and including, again, any questions of clarifications you may want to pose to Serge with respect to his presentation. So I'll start off today with a question to Joe from the CBD Secretariat, and it's really related to the question about the role of fisheries OECMs in the emerging global biodiversity framework, but a little bit of perspective from the CBD Secretariat. Joe, and I'll turn that over to you.
Thank you, Renee. And thank you also for the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this useful discussion. It's important to have, and in my view, it's important to have these kinds of informal discussions as we, I think, explore a bit more this relatively new concept that is nonetheless grounded in the reality of what many fisheries communities and fisheries management organizations are already doing, but nonetheless getting our heads around how we can understand and assess it and better implement especially from a biodiversity perspective. So I think to understand the value and the place of OECMs in the post-2020 framework, it's really useful for us to look back at the Aichi biodiversity targets. and learn lessons from the Aichi targets, both the successes of the Aichi targets and importantly, I think where we failed in the Aichi targets. And it is important to note that although we did achieve some elements of the Aichi targets, there are no Aichi targets that we fully achieved all elements for, and that includes the area-based conservation target. We expect to hit the 10% goal, I think, relatively soon, but certainly not with respect to the qualitative aspects of the target, the effectiveness, the equitable management, the representativeness. And one of the reasons across the Aichi targets that we know very well as to the failure of the Aichi targets is the fact that many drivers of biodiversity loss were not adequately addressed, because many and as part of that, many sectors and many actors and users of biodiversity that engage in both in the use of biodiversity as well as in some degree conservation were not adequately engaged by the Aichi targets. They didn't really see themselves in the Aichi targets. They didn't see a place for themselves and what they were doing. And in many ways, they saw it as a bit of a one-way discussion, as a bit of a new requirements coming from the conservation community, telling us what to do, basically, and pointing fingers at us for messing up and the reason for how bad things are. Of course, that's not a productive way to have a relationship and enhance both of our areas of interests. So I think what's really useful about the OECMs is, first, it acknowledges that fisheries and the fisheries sector don't only do sustainable use. They also do conservation. So I think in a lot of ways, when we were first bringing in when we were like looking at ways to better engage the sectors and different sectors in the development of the framework, we were rightfully being told that sectoral engagement and sectoral perspectives are not only part of the sustainable use mandate of the convention, but are also highly relevant to the conservation mandate of the convention. I think OECMs bring that forward very well and articulate again that OECMs, which are maybe it's a new classification, but by and large, it's focused on identifying things that in many ways are already being implemented. But it shows that the fishery sector is doing conservation as part of its business. So that was a really positive aspect to build on. And as I said, it acknowledges also not only that fisheries and the fishery sector can do conservation, but also are already doing conservation in a lot of ways. And in some ways, even if we're not considering or calling it conservation or assessing it in that respect. So this is a really important paradigm to bring into the post-2020 framework that acknowledges that even as part of ways of doing business in different sectors, there will be conservation actions that are already taking place and that can be built on and enhanced. So when we look at also the place for OECMs in the in the post-2020 framework, we also see a lot of value brought in by the fact that the framework is, as compared to the Aichi targets, the way that the framework is evolving now is that it is not only focusing on action-oriented targets, but the goals and outcomes of what we're trying to achieve. So, we're not saying what has to be done, but what are we trying to do with this? And this in our experience is a really useful starting point for any discussion between conservation communities and user communities, to say, what are our shared goals? Even if we speak different languages, we understand action needs differently, we probably have shared objectives at many different levels. So that factor there, and the fact that the goals aspect, the outcomes aspect, is clearly put front and center at the Aichi in the post-2020 framework, is really an important basis for us to move forward on. And I think also, as we know, many of the discussions around the post-2020 framework have focused on an enhanced numerical goal, a quantitative goal for protection of the ocean. 30% has been thrown out there quite a bit. There's a lot of support around 30% protection of the ocean. And OECMs provide a fantastic tool to do that. OECMs can, in fact, that this is, again, they emerged from the target 11 and the Aichi target 11 on 10% protection, and they certainly should have, in I think in many of our views, a place under the quantitative protection or a quantitative protection target in the post 2020 framework. And it really, I think when we see some of the reactions that we had to these enhanced numbers, and especially some reactions from parts of the developing world saying, oh my God, we couldn't even get to 10%. How the hell are we going to get to 30 or anything like that? This is a compelling argument because it says, actually, it's not necessarily a whole suite of new measures. It's probably acknowledging and maybe improving a bit what you're already doing in many ways. So this is it provides it makes that low-hanging fruit like maybe a little easier to grasp, I think, for many countries around the world that are struggling with implementation. It also, in our view, provides a really important and really tangible reason and catalyst for cross-sectoral collaboration at the national level, and that's in multiple respects. So in one of the, and if I'm going on too much, please jump in and stop me. But in many respects, one of the things that we saw in terms of the failings to some degree of the Aichi targets was we weren't getting adequate information on the status of systems and the status of implementation. We weren't having adequate, robust cross-sectoral reporting and assessment and monitoring. We did see in many ways and in many places that reporting to the CBD by countries was done by the ministries of environment. We very often, and I think it's probably a product of human nature as much as institutional systems, but a lot of ministries of environment in many cases would see that CBD is my thing and I report to CBD, and I'll let you other ministries know if we need any information, but we're probably fine. But as a result, of course, we don't get information on all the different things that we know are happening and that are highly relevant. So in this case, you have to, if we're talking about reporting OECMs, it has to come from the fisheries sector because they're the ones who are actually doing it. So it really provides a tangible, again, a tangible catalyst for collaboration and reporting. Also for having a tangible catalyst for collaboration and implementation. Although it is a fisheries measure, in many ways, if we're trying to understand, I think, the biodiversity elements of it and the biodiversity outcomes, and in many ways, some of those may not be fully assessed or understood in these existing fisheries measures. You will, in many ways, require biodiversity expertise in some way, and in some cases, that expertise may not exist in the fisheries management regimes that we're looking at. So it does provide another avenue for tangible collaboration and implementation. And then finally, it also has a really useful avenue for making the fisheries sector stewards to some degree, even enhanced stewards of biodiversity. So of course they're stewards over the fisheries and the fishing that's happening in those places. But if a sector has an OECM designation, which obviously has biodiversity benefits there, it then provides a bit, it provides a bit of an impetus for that sector to make sure that other uses or other users of the environment are not coming in and impacting the viability of that designation and the status of that designation. So it then becomes not only the sort of biodiversity conservation community looking out for the biodiversity benefits, but also the fisheries community looking out for the biodiversity benefits and ensuring that other sectors are not impacting that. And of course, not impacting the productivity and the sustainability of the fish catch, but also of the biodiversity benefits of those measures. So I'll stop there, but really, I think what this signals to us is a really tangible area of collaboration that both the conservation world and the fisheries world can really see themselves in, really see something that is part of what they both have shared goals around and what they both are already doing, and a really clear rationale and that catalyst for collaboration across these different communities to actually make these things happen. So, thank you.
Excellent points, Joe. Thanks for that. I think a number of our participants today are probably quite involved, or were involved probably with developing the previous goals under Aichi and involved now in the emerging new set. So I think your reflections are very very useful for people. I think it's quite clear from the dialogue that there is a lot of desire to work across sectors and to get biodiversity integrated in there. The question is how to do it. So your point about OECMs being an excellent example of being a key tool for mainstreaming in the context of our discussions today, mainstreaming in fisheries. And the fishery sector does, when people talk about activities in the marine environment, it's the first sector that people go to. So very, 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 OECMs very relevant, I think, to discussions and emerging targets. So just to remind participants that they can pose any questions they have to our panelists, and including, again, any questions of clarification you might have had on the presentation. So please use the Q&A portion to indicate your question and who you'd like to pose it to. I think I'm not seeing a specific question here for our panelist or Joe. So I think I will move on to another one of our panelists today, and I think I'll move to you, Daniela. I think Joe raised some interesting points about different communities and institutional challenges that were faced with this OECM issue. So I think you've got appropriate experience in that. So I'll turn that question over to you, Daniela. What are some of the key institutional challenges we're really looking at in advancing OECMs in fisheries?
Thanks, Renee. Thank you so much. And thanks also to the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And thanks for the question. In respect to some of those challenges, so I was participating also in the workshop, the IUCN workshop that Serge was talking about. And some of the things that we identified, some of the challenges, but also opportunities on the other hand, like the flip coin of challenges is also the opportunities that it provides. In terms of the OECMs in the fishery sector specifically, is when we're applying the criteria to those case studies that Serge mentioned, one of the things that became very obvious to all of us in analyzing the case studies and trying to apply the criteria, especially the criterion B on the legitimate authority. Who is the legitimate authority? How, if there's more than one, how are they working together to address multiple threats to the conservation of biodiversity, so that you can actually achieve the objective or of the definition of OECM, which is to have positive biodiversity outcomes coming out of that specific measure. And of course, the fishery sector, be it in national jurisdiction under the Ministry of Fisheries or under a specific local community or indigenous peoples groups, could be affected by other activities that are not controlled by them, not controlled by that specific authority. So that's in national jurisdiction, under national jurisdiction, and you would need some sort of cooperation, which in our case studies that we looked at, the observation was that, of course, within national jurisdiction, it might be easier, or at least we expect it to be a little bit easier to have that coordination at the national level. And that's what Joe was alluding as well, which I think it also provides a very good opportunity for that cross-sectoral coordination across ministries, across governments, subnational governments as well, indigenous peoples and local communities, to engage with other sectors to avoid that an activity might be posing a threat to an area-based conservation measure that is to be described or recognized as an OECM. One challenge that we noticed when we were addressing the case studies was really with respect to areas beyond national jurisdiction, because at the moment, of course, there is no coordinating authority at the global level to facilitate that coordination. Of course, there are specific organizations that have memorandum of understanding between regional fisheries management organizations and regional seas organizations, and they're expanding those memorandum of understanding with also other sectors, other authorities that regulate other sectors, but there is no overarching coordinating mechanism for that to happen, and that was perceived as a challenge. So when we were, applying the criteria, we said, okay, so for this specific fishery measure here that we are describing as a potential OECM, there is a legitimate fisheries authority that's in control of that measure, but not necessarily on other threats that could be posed to that area. So how are we going to look at that? So one of the recommendations that arose, or the observations that participants had, was to look at it needs to be on a case-by-case basis. The recognition of OECM as it's reflected at CBG decision 14/8. In doing so, that analysis, we can identify, okay, are there memorandum of understanding between this specific RFMO and the ISA, for example, the International Seabed Authority, or the Sargasso Sea Commission, or the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, or, in doing so, we could have a better understanding of whether or not those concerns are being taken into account. So in that sense, it also presented itself, that challenge, as an opportunity for having more of those. And there is a case, that the other area that we thought could be also an opportunity, and especially from, some of my participation in NAFO meetings in Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organizations, I noticed that from time to time, the NAFO Commission asked the Scientific Council to assess what other activities could be posing threats to the NAFO regulatory area, even though, of course, NAFO won't have the mandate to regulate those other activities. But one first step that I think it's very helpful is to understand what the other threats are, and then you can identify what needs to be done next in terms of either having memorandum of understanding or any other forms of cooperation. And that has been done, for example, with the Canadian Petroleum Board, in the case of the extended continental shelf of Canada that overlays with some of the VME areas that NAFO regulates. So that has, I think it's a positive thing or idea to have in mind in terms of having RFMOs as an agenda item of RFMOs to look into other threats, even if they don't have the mandate to do anything about it, but at least it can provide an avenue for cooperation with other sectors. One thing that helps, I think, in that case, for example, is the allusion to the inclusion of the ecosystem approach into their conventions, because NAFO, the amended convention, has that the mandate to apply the ecosystem approach. So not necessarily in terms of regulating other activities, of course not, but at least to understand the ecosystem and to understand what the pressures are to that ecosystem, to manage it in a way that is in accordance to the ecosystem approach. And so finally, one thing that you mentioned also, Renee, in your introduction, the BBNJ agreement, this negotiations of a new implementation agreement to the Law of the Sea Convention that's being negotiated at the UN at the moment, for areas beyond national, for biodiversity conservation, sustainable use of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that might provide also an opportunity for that coordination at the global level of activities. And I think at the moment, the text of the agreement doesn't contain any reference to OECMs, but it does have reference to area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So there is a question, the text is still up for negotiations, and negotiations are still going on. So there is an opportunity perhaps to take that on board. But of course, the CBG is already doing it. I think the the relationship between the CBD and the Law of the Sea Convention is very close. I think it's very unique. It's reflected in the CBD text as well, the convention text in Articles 4 and 22, and also UNCLOS has, it's not to be applied in a vacuum. It should be applied in concert with other conventions and treaties. And the BBNJ agreement could pose that opportunity as well to complement and walk hand in hand with all those good initiatives that the CBD is doing. And the OECM is one example of that. So I'll stop here for now, but yeah, happy to offer more reflections as we go forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniela. That was an excellent kind of overview of clearly there's a desire to do more mainstreaming across sectors and to have the different communities connected. But your observations there indicate, there are some more of the practical challenges of how we institutionally need to get these different players better connected. So I found that very useful. Thanks for that. So something to think about there. Certainly, it's very current in terms of being able to use regional bodies like RFMOs who may have a mandate, but maybe not to manage for biodiversity, but to more formally put that in their considerations related to their decision-making processes. And of course, the opportunity related to the new UN emerging agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction there, another opportunity to make sure these dots, these connections are real and are made. So things do not fall through the cracks. So very useful. Thank you for that. Listen, we did, I see looking at the Q&A, we have gotten an interesting question. It actually relates a little bit more to some of the scientific considerations for OECMs and fisheries. So I think I will turn now to our FAO expert here, focusing on OECMs and dealing with often many of these scientific challenges. So I will turn to Amber to maybe give us a bit of an overview of some of the key scientific challenges on OECMs, and maybe also to consider this specific question that we have got from our participants, which is interesting. And it is, what if a fisheries measure contributes to protecting one aspect of biodiversity, but ignores other important biodiversity values of that area? Should it still be considered an OECM? So I think that's a good question, and I've heard that from other people. So it would be interesting to have some reflections on that. So I will turn it over to you, Amber, now to maybe touch on some of these more technical scientific challenges related to OECMs and fisheries. Over to you, Amber.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you to Sarah for that question. It is an important question. I'm not sure I have a full answer for you, but I can at least give my opinion on it. And the one word in your question that kind of caught my attention is the word ignore. So you said, what if a fishery measure contributes to protecting one aspect of biodiversity, but it ignores other important aspects? And I think that kind of goes along with something that Daniela touched on a little bit, which is the same thing of if the fisheries sector is just looking at managing the fisheries, but not necessarily managing other threats like oil and gas or shipping or any tourism, other things like that. It's the same kind of concept there, where we have to come up with good ways for collaboration, basically between sectors. So that's kind of one aspect of this question, but it also talks about, for example, I've heard many discussions about the fact that the oceans are three-dimensional, and that a lot of fisheries measures or other types of area-based management measures in the oceans are focused on one part of the ecosystem, whether it be the bottom habitat or surface waters, but it doesn't most fisheries measures in general don't necessarily aim to protect the entire water column. And so that kind of goes in line with what Sarah's asking as well, in terms of if you're only looking at a fisheries closure that focuses on bottom species, like in the North Atlantic, there are the deep water corals, there are other kinds of fish species that live just on the bottom. If you're focused on those, what happens to threats that might be affecting species that are in the water column? And I think that's a really important consideration that hasn't is still being discussed in many different forums, and there's not really a good answer. And part of the problem right now is that the OECM criteria hasn't really been tested very well. We've only got one country, and that's Canada, who's got officially OECMs in the marine environment. We have a few countries that have them terrestrially, but it hasn't really been tested out. And so I think one of the things that we need to move forward on and help each other, help countries with, is to figure out how do we address those kinds of challenges. Some of the other scientific challenges I think that are really important along the same lines is that we need to think about interpretation and thresholds. There are lots of different opinions about how the different OECM criteria should be interpreted, what thresholds should be set for whether or not you say yes or no, it counts or it doesn't count. So I think that there are, I've heard a lot of countries say that they're afraid of being one of the first ones in their region to establish an OECM because they're afraid of setting a precedent for the future, and they don't want to set the bar too low. And so there's a lot of kind of fear about that, and people not knowing exactly where to go. And I think that's one area that collectively, whether it's FAO, IUCN, other kinds of organizations like the RFMOs, our role there is to help countries come together and figure out what the right answer is for our region, or for the region that's being discussed. One of the benefits of the OECM criteria is that it specifically says in the decision that it's meant to be applied on a case-by-case and flexible basis. And so there is that leeway in there for countries to look at it and say, okay, based off of what I have in my current situation, what can I do? What kind of application of the criteria can I make and not? Another significant scientific challenge is when you have data limited situations. There's a lot of countries in the world that don't have very good monitoring systems set up. They don't have ways of tracking the biodiversity values and outcomes in an area. And so that there have to be ways that we can come up with to look at those kind of situations, so that countries aren't just left out and said, well, you don't have any data, therefore you can't have any OECMs. We don't want to cut people out. I think the biggest value of OECMs is that it's meant to be inclusive. It's meant to let sectors work together and countries work together to figure out the best ways that we can to protect biodiversity, rather than being this top-down way that the Aichi targets were, or how they were treated, at least, where countries were basically told and sectors were basically told, this is what we're going to do. It was mainly ending up in marine protected areas for Aichi Target 11. And I think a lot of sectors really felt left out of the process that way. So we really have a good opportunity here to try to figure out ways of addressing this. Other scientific challenges that I've kind of thought of, come across, is what happens if you have an OECM that you don't have a good monitoring plan for? What happens if a fishery measure contributes to what if its intent is to contribute to just fisheries sustainability issues and focused on target species, but as a byproduct of it, it's also protecting other species, but there's no data on it for monitoring purposes. Those are going to be some challenges that we have to come up with ways of how do we address that, and how do we say that, yes, a fisheries management plan is addressing certain issues, doesn't need to be modified in order to be able to monitor different biodiversity aspects of an area. There's lots of different things like this that I know lots of us have been thinking about. I know Andy in the North Atlantic has been thinking about this as well. And so I'll stop there and see if anybody has anything else to add, or if Renee, you want to move on. I see there's another panelist or another question in the chat as well.
Yeah, thanks, Amber, for that. Again, very interesting to hear about some of very practical challenges we have, and when I say we, I mean we as an international community. So the challenges do vary immensely. So Especially, I think, for those dealing with the new biodiversity framework, we need to keep this in mind. What we put down to commit on paper, we have to keep in mind these practical challenges related to capacity, also about being able to implement these sort of things. You raised a very interesting point there, Amber, about the bar and where to set the bar, and how we decide what's in and out, and that really makes me start to think about, again, some of these very practical operational challenges related to OECMs. So and I see that we do have a question that is very much, related to, again, these operational challenges, and how we decide what's in and out related to that. So I think I'm going to actually turn to Andrew. You next. You, I think, have through your work have given a fair amount of thought to some of these operational challenges. So I'll let you sort of maybe provide a little bit of overview there of related to your experience. And then I would also actually pose this question to you, Andrew, that we had came in. So it's a question, and I'll just read it directly, that says, note, this is looking at Serge's presentation, noting that all 6 case studies reviewed at the workshop qualify as fisheries OECMs, and the U.S. fishery sector is already proposing that U.S. fisheries qualify as fisheries OECMs due to compliance with the Magnuson-Stevenson Act. Have we already achieved the 30 by 30 based on how you are defining fisheries OECMs? So that's a good pointed question. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rennie. And yeah, once again, thank you to the organisers for inviting me to this panel discussion. Yeah, I think we're probably very much on the way to 30% if we consider all the various fishery area-based management measures. And I'm just thinking of all the various sort of seamount polygon closures we've got in the NAFO area, and if you kind of reflect that similar situation globally, that's quite a chunk of marine habitat you've got there. But I think it does come back to understanding what the real benefits are, of these various measures. And I just want to come back briefly to the discussion there that was raised by the previous question, I think from Sarah, because assessing the biodiversity benefits, which is implicit within the guidance and the OECM criteria, I mean, it necessitates looking at the connections between the components of the ecosystem, and those components will also include significant other biodiverse features. And one of the case studies we looked at actually dealt with this. It was the sand eel closure in the northwestern part of the North Sea. And that closure wasn't set up to protect the sand eels. It was set up to really halt the decline in the breeding success of seabirds, and in particular, I think it was the kittiwake. So we are looking at wider benefits, and so the system that you're protecting may itself not have particularly high levels of biodiversity. In fact, it may be a very resilient, very productive, low diverse system, but it is supporting, through the food web, through to higher trophic levels, significant aspects of biodiversity that we value and that we want to protect. So I think that's an important point about these OECMs, which probably sets them apart from the MPAs and the criteria and some of the processes around setting up MPAs. So, but coming back to these operational challenges, and I have to admit that I'm coming at this question really from my position, my experiences, the baggage that I have, which is predominantly RFMO related. The research that I've been doing on significant adverse impacts has been primarily with the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organisation. So I apologise to start with if what I'm now going to describe really is, in trying to address the question on these operational challenges, has a bit of an RFMO bias. But I do see that the operational challenges basically fall into three key areas. And these key areas, well, the first of these key areas is the management and scope of governance associated with the legitimate authority. And that follows on kind of nicely from what Danny was explaining in relation to the institutional challenges, because of getting the institutional challenges addressed is basically enabler to allowing you to address the operational challenges. You can't address the operational challenges unless you've got the right institutional stuff in place, and that's around the management and scope of governance associated with the legitimate authorities. The second operational challenge area relates to monitoring and assessment of the fisheries themselves. I mean, this implies that you have in place appropriate monitoring, compliance and surveillance systems, that you're able to track the fishing activity that's going on within your jurisdiction using things like the vessel monitoring systems and also satellite AIS. But also you need to have systems that can verify the catches both on the vessels, especially offshore, and at the ports where the catches are being landed. So, all of that kind of needs to be in place. But that clearly poses a much greater challenge operationally if your fisheries are dominated by small-scale fisheries. But nevertheless, I'm seeing advances in some of the technologies, especially the remote sensing technologies that can, I think, help to address some of those challenges around monitoring, compliance and surveillance of the small-scale fisheries. And there's also the rapidly evolving mobile communications technology, which is very much global and not just something associated with well-resourced nations. And then the third sort of operational challenge area then relates to how you do the assessment of the biodiversity benefits and the performance of the measure itself. And ideally you would have some form of fishery independent monitoring and assessment of the target feature. You'd clearly need some level of coordination and definitely need access to funds. So you'd need funding to conduct fishery independent surveys. So that's not without its challenges. And you would need access to expertise that can obviously assess and report on the data gathered. But just taking a step back from that for a minute, I mean, the whole operational consideration really starts with understanding and recognizing who the legitimate management authority is. And that's maybe not as simple as it sounds, especially where you have an OECM which straddles different jurisdictions, and where there's also the lack of cross-sectoral frameworks, which Danny mentioned. I mean, these can definitely pose challenges when assessing and maintaining the desired outcomes from the OECMs. But in the case of the high seas, the legitimate authority will invariably be an RFMO. So in these cases, especially where it's an RFMO, there should already be conservation enforcement measures in place, which set out things like the use of the VMS data and the types of gear that should be used and where the fisheries and when the fisheries should be operating. But also furthermore that the RFMOs do abide by the UN Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, and there are obviously the specific requirements which are laid out in the various UN General Assembly resolutions, all of which are imposes on the RFMOs obligations, and though the RFMOs are indeed subject to periodic performance review, which is an independently conducted process. So there's no holds barred, when these reviews are conducted, and the outcome of the reviews definitely has, from my experience, improved the work of the RFMOs over the last decade or so. So these aspects are typically enshrined within the convention text of the RFMOs. So for the RFMOs, I don't think this is so much of a problem. But obviously, when you're dealing with fishery management systems or management organizations which are less resource rich, if you're looking at fishery management systems which are not so well developed, then simply tracking and monitoring what is happening in the fishery from one day to the next will be the greatest challenge of that organization. And suffice to say, in such situations, you will be typically faced with data limited circumstances. And so this is where I think knowledge transfer from those data rich organizations and regions that are managing fisheries could potentially be useful, especially if such areas support the same types of habitat and species which are thought to also occur in the data limited area under consideration. So in summary, I see the precise nature of the operational challenges ultimately to be area and regional specific. But nevertheless, I think it is possible to identify kind of a hierarchical set of challenges, if you like, framed as questions that the legitimate authority will need to address. And to some extent, these questions are also reflected in the text of the OECM criteria itself. So the first of these is, are all the biodiversity threats under the control and the jurisdiction of the legitimate authority in question? And are all these threats known about and understood? The second challenge is the proposed OECM located spatially, entirely within the jurisdiction of the legitimate authority? I mean, if not, then you are getting into the realms of cooperation agreements with the other authorities, and that is not without its obvious challenges. The third challenge then relates to addressing suitable management and governance processes, making sure that they're in place to ensure the long-term sustainability of the benefits. And then finally, is there a sufficiently well understood set of benefits? I mean, hopefully, drawing together all the stakeholders, there should be consensus around the benefits associated with the OECM, but actually understanding all the different sort of causalities, the links, the trophic interactions, the wider ecosystem benefits associated with some of those underpinning biodiversity features is where for many of the OECMs under consideration, further work is needed. So I hope this provides you with some food for thought and triggers some further questions to get into perhaps a little bit more of the detail around those challenge areas that I've highlighted. But yeah, thanks.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Very interesting, and the more I hear about the OECM criteria, and for example, those 4 key questions you posed, the more it makes me think that we are developing much better rigor around OECMs than what MPAs have.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
So I know for a long time, and the initial negotiations related to area coverage in MPAs, the biggest concern is, of course, the paper parks. So, and I would say that's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah.
You know, we heard about setting the bar. Well, you know, really, there doesn't seem to be much of a bar related to MPAs, and that's a concern in terms of anything being able to qualify as an MPA. So I'm actually encouraged. We seem to be taking a more rigorous, thoughtful approach that, with respect to OECMs, that really should support a longer term payoff on biodiversity benefits. But anyways, that's just my impressions. Thanks for that, Andrew. You had touched a little bit on an aspect that we haven't talked too much about yet. And I think that is when you mentioned sort of the data rich and the data poor areas, and some obligations there to ensure transfer. And it kind of touches on, I would say, both equity and effectiveness related to, you know, trying to advance OECM. So we haven't talked too much about that. So I'll sort of leave that out there. This was kind of an aspect that we were hoping that Mr. Jonas could to reflect on a bit more, but I'll maybe steer that a little bit to Serge's way as he's trying to cover off some of those things. In addition, though, to sort of this effectiveness question in a global context, we actually have, you'd asked about questions, Andrew. We actually have gotten a couple of more questions, and I will just read them out, and I'm going to sort of do a bit more freewheeling after Serge starts us off. In terms of any one of our panelists, I think, can address these questions, and I'll just read off the 2 questions we did get. So the first one is, are there ways to account for area-based fisheries management efforts or outcomes outside of what is now CBD Target 2? In other words, the ambition for 30 by 30. That was our first question. And the second question, sorry, the end of that question is, could much of that count towards CBD Target 4 on sustainable harvest and trade? That was question 1. The second question we got is, if the concept of OECMs is so strong and so compatible with sectoral biodiversity approaches that they already apply, why has there been so little uptake in the decade since Target 11 was adopted? I think that's fairly not a bad observation. So those are a couple of more general questions. And maybe I'll just start off by turning to you, Serge, to comment. But really, I think we can open it. We got another 15 minutes, so I think we can open it up for any one of our panelists to address. Now, I can see all the panelists on my screen, so you can either just physically raise your hand, and or I think there is a raised hand option that I can see on the screen. But let's start off with you, Serge, and any observation, comments from your perspective?
Thank you, Renee. You were asking me to look particularly at effectiveness, or are any of those questions interesting questions that you just listed?
Well, just because we don't have Harry with us today, I didn't know if you had any reflections on this sort of equity issue and effectiveness in a global context from countries with much capacity versus those with less capacity. So I didn't know if you had any reflections on that, but certainly those 2 questions are open to any of the panelists also.
Okay. Well, effectiveness is a question that was discussed many times during the workshop in various ways. First, one of the questions was, how do you measure effectiveness? And an important part of the debate was that it could be because the measures you are applying are in principle very effective, or it could be because you are measuring year after year that the outcomes expected on biodiversity are really being created. And there are many instances, and the debate was essentially on the fact that to measure biodiversity effectiveness in producing biodiversity benefits was something that could be pretty costly in terms of surveys. And in many cases, the fisheries would not have the means to do it. But that in fact, if like around many of the VMEs in the North Atlantic, if the fisheries were closed and bottom fishing was prohibited totally, and there were observers on 100% of the vessels and they were controlled by satellite, etc., one could assume that the performance of the constraints are sufficiently well assured that one could assume that the biodiversity is rebuilding in the area or maintained, and that can be checked with less, let's say, less frequent surveys to check that the outcomes are really happening. The efficiency is usually seen in terms of biodiversity impact, although we have to remind our audience that an OECM in fisheries is usually a fishery management closure that has been established for fishery management purpose. So it needs to be effective not only for biodiversity, but also as a fishery management. And if it's efficient as a fishery management measure, it is maintained as a fishery management measure. If it's not effective enough in terms of biodiversity, it has to lose its status as an OECM. But there are two levels of efficiency. Efficiency have rarely been connected to equity. There's always been in terms of efficiency regarding the fishery sustainability or regarding the biodiversity benefits. But of course, equity is also an important parameter. The CBD definition for the concept of equity is attached to what is called in the definition equitable governance. And equitable governance is clearly defined in three terms. Equity in recognition of the stakeholders, and particularly the important one and the vulnerable ones, etc. Equity in terms of procedures, meaning that there is real opportunity for participation, active participation into the processes as they are designed. And the third is equity in distribution of cost and benefits of the measure. And in this case, of course, we are talking about the cost and benefit of inserting an OECM. In some cases, if there has been there for some time, those issues have already been there for some time, if there is any issue. If the OECM is modified, increased, or the rules of access are changed, then of course there will be some equity issues, and there are no international standards of what is equitable and what is not. So it is in general, it's a local problem that has to be dealt with locally. And the main answer that you usually find to deal with this fuzzy and important problem of equity is to ensure active participation in decision making by all of the ones that are going to be impacted by the measure. That's one way of having equity emerging like an emergent property of a complex management system. That's about these 2 points. I have also a question a short response perhaps to the question of, if biodiversity impacts are so important for fisheries, why is it that very little happened since 2010? And I think the key reason is that there was no definition of OECMs. I mean, the state or the sector didn't even know what they were. Now that they have been defined in 2018, people start moving a little bit faster. But before that, although there were in many fisheries interest in biodiversity, in reducing bycatch, in protecting protected endangered and threatened species, etc., all that was not accounted, and there was perhaps not such a clear distinction between non-spatial measures and spatial measures. But now that we talk about OECM, suddenly the space-based measures are taking more importance, and there is a lot more focus on that. And to respond perhaps to Claude as well, it's a very provocative question, because of course, if, as we have seen, many areas could be OECMs, does that mean that the 30% are already reached? And if they are reached, does that mean that the biodiversity is not threatened anymore? And of course, that's not true for 2 reasons. One, I think because that the rate of having areas that fit the criteria is totally anomalous. It's because it's the North Atlantic, and the areas have been well selected by the participants and came with a big and large body of understanding and knowledge. And in fact, many of those areas were primarily designed for protection in the fishery system, and not primarily designed for fishery, but for biodiversity protection. So the result is not surprising for the North Atlantic area. But I don't think this conclusion would apply to the world as a whole. I think it would be only a very small proportion of areas used in fisheries that will qualify for OECMs, and I don't think it will be that easy to reach the 30%. To go into what Andy was saying before about seamounts, etc., we have to remember one point. A seamount that is standing alone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no management at all is not an OECM, even if it's very good for biodiversity. It has to be an area which is part of a management system that is controlled, surveyed, monitored, etc. So it requires a financial effort, which means that you cannot just declare as OECMs any area outside there that is doing fine. No.
Yeah, if I could just come back, is that okay, Randy? Yeah, so 30% of nothing is nothing, and I think what the OECMs are really forcing us to look at are what are the benefits. It's no good having the vast majority of your seamount closure effectively covering abyssal plain. So it really comes back to making sure that your target setting is really set around the appropriate attributes of the biodiversity and the functionality associated with that biodiversity to deliver, what's expected. I think in that respect, you're right. There's a lot of area around some of these features that is probably doing very little in terms of, the need to protect biodiversity and nature.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm not going to interject too much because I've got a couple more questions which I've shared with the panelists. So please, panelists, any of these questions you want to comment on, please go ahead. I saw your hand, Joe. Please.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a few a few of these questions that are kind of talking around these thoughts that I had in my mind, and for me a lot the kind of thinking and my own approach to looking at this issue is inclusiveness and integrity is there's a great opportunity and benefit of the OECMs about in terms of broadening the community of conservation, of biodiversity conservation, and feeling and ensuring that the huge amount of people that are involved in fisheries management then feel like they're also a part more so of the conservation world and doing conservation, but certainly we have to bring integrity along with that and ensure that we're not just giving a rubber stamp to things that may seem nice or may sound like they're actually doing something. So if we go back to Target 11 and Aichi Target 11, where this concept came from, we have to remember that the whole goal of Target 11 was having area conserved. It's areas conserved through protected areas and OECMs. So in that vein, I think this comes back to an earlier question about, if there's only one biodiversity benefit or some aspects are conserved, does that mean that it's okay? And I think of course it comes down to a case-by-case issue, but we have to look at it in the context of where that sort of rationale came from for OECMs. And then also coming back to the question, I think it was a really pointed question and very, very relevant to say that, okay, if so many fisheries measures are already doing these things, everything should be peachy keen, right? And I think this is where the integrity comes into that. And I think in this respect, we're still at the cusp of this. We're still at the beginning. But in my estimation, I would think that there are some fisheries measures that would in their current form qualify as OECMs. There are some that would certainly not in any way or be even close to it because they're focused on different things. But there are probably a lot that currently maybe don't, but with some tweaks, with some changes, with some additional things brought in, could and would do that. So there's a huge opportunity there in closing that gap. And in that also brings us to looking at how we actually get to 30%, because, or 30% or whatever the parties decide, a number that parties are putting out, that parties want to achieve. Because if we think that this will all be achieved through designation of whole new protected areas all over the world, we're certainly not going to have those effectively implemented in the next 10 years. So is it better? And it is better, I would say. I'll answer my own question. I think it's better in many cases to say, how can we improve our existing measures rather than relying on all new designations, which may or may not even be able to do better what's already out there. So I think the opportunity that we're talking about and the opportunity that this presents in getting to these higher ambition targets is not to say that they're all good and doing what they're doing and let's just say great and thank you, we're there, but saying how can we add incremental value to what's already doing? How can we tweak what we're already doing and all of the resources we've already put into those things to just make up that additional missing gap? So thank you.
Thanks for that, Joe. We have a tiny bit of time left. Do any of our panelists have a burning desire to address any of the questions? And just a reminder to participants, this is being recorded and we are keeping track of all the questions. And we will make an attempt to address them even after this session today. But maybe I'll give the opportunity over to you, Amber, to comment.
Great, thank you, Renee. I just wanted to touch on the last question that was put in the chat box by Ellen. She asked whether or not there might need to be a consideration of new criteria or a new way of thinking about new OECMs. So following on just what you said, or what Joe had just mentioned about trying to close the gap with what we've already got and trying to make them better, there is also eventually going to be this discussion of how do we make new ones. And some countries, who knows, might want to skip over trying to make the ones that they have already in place better and maybe go straight to how do we make new fisheries management measures that would be consistent with the OECM criteria. And in that regard, I don't really have a good answer because it hasn't been, since we haven't really had very many areas in the oceans in fisheries put forward as OECMs. It's hard to say what new OECMs might have to face in terms of how they might be designed and what kind of measures they might have to include in them in order to be able to meet the criteria. However, I did want to take the opportunity to put in a plug for the work that FAO is doing, which is where we now, after the Kofi meeting in February, FAO has a mandate from our member countries asking us specifically to create a set of guidance and guidelines on how to look at OECMs in the fisheries sector and how to do that assessment process. And as part of that, we will be looking at what is the whole of the assessment process, and that will probably end up with some considerations both for existing existing fisheries management measures that you might be assessing, as well as how do you then take the criteria and think about creating a new fisheries management measure that might meet the OECM criteria. So eventually that will become part of the discourse. And as part of that effort, we will also be holding a series of regional workshops over the next couple of years to try to get at some of the regional differences in how the OECM criteria might be either interpreted or where challenges might exist or emerging issues that we haven't even thought of before. So I'm sure that question will be coming up time and time again, and hopefully through the regional workshops, we'll be getting more input from countries on how do we want to address that.
That's a perfect segue, Amber, I think, to conclude our session on today. I'm reluctant to stop because I think things are just getting warmed up, but we do have limitations of time. So I think I definitely will not try and summarize all the good points raised today. I just want to specifically thank our panelists, the very good things to get us to think about here. I noticed a common thread throughout a lot of the responses, and opportunity kept coming up, the word. So despite the challenges we have ahead of us and we've had in the past, I think what I heard a lot of today is that we actually have made a fair investment in making this practically functional with real outcomes. So it is an opportunity to get things right. And we've just heard, again, there's a lot happening and coming up through the FAO's efforts, et cetera. So again, opportunity was a word I heard a lot. So I actually do find that quite encouraging. So just to conclude today, again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. Everyone is very busy, and I know some of the hours are probably not very accommodating for our participants. So thanks for joining us. As I mentioned, this session is recorded. The link will be provided to you on the event website. Any pertinent questions you posed today that we could not get to specifically, we will ask our experts. You're not free yet. We will ask our experts to review and we'll endeavor to get back to you. I would also note actually that the ICES report that was noted in Serge's presentation on OECMs has just come out, I think yesterday, and it's available on the ICES website, so that may be of interest to you. I would also note that there is a related side event also hosted by EBCD. I think I got that right. Tomorrow, and that is on the ACHI Target 6, which was on fisheries and considering on how to deliver on mainstreaming biodiversity in fisheries. So as you can see, quite a related topic. So same time tomorrow. If participants are interested in having participating in that, I note that. So again, I won't go on much longer, but just to thank you for joining us and participating. I hope people found it useful. I look forward that we'll be able to all gather in person someday. So until then, take care and yes, as I indicated, if we didn't address your question, we will try and follow up after this event. That's all from me.
Thank you. It was great.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.